everyone. Thank you for joining us today and welcome to another webinar in the Tokyo College series. We have simultaneous translation available for this lecture, so if you'd like to use this and hear this lecture in Japanese, please find the relevant Zoom function. And my name is Anna WOZNY. I'm a joint postdoctoral fellow here at Tokyo College and at Princeton University, and I'll be serving as a moderator during today's event. And as a sociologist working on contemporary Japan, it's truly my honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor John Lee. Professor Lee is Distinguished Professor of Sociology at the University of California, Berkeley, and a Tokyo College visiting professor. He was born in Seoul and grew up both in Japan and Hawaii. He received his AB and PhD in sociology from Harvard University and subsequently taught at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he was head of sociology, and also at the University of Michigan, where he directed the Center for Japanese Studies and the Korean Studies program. In addition, he has held teaching and visiting positions at a number of universities all around the world, including the University of Hawaii at Manoa, Yonsei University in Korea, and Keio University in Japan. And at Berkeley, he also served as the Dean of International and Area Studies. Professor Lee is one of the world's foremost experts on social theory, and he has written extensively on wide-ranging topics and areas of interest, including East Asian political economy, national identity, globalization and transnationalism, race and ethnicity, popular culture, and many, many others. He's authored more than half a dozen scholarly monographs, including his seminal work on multiculturalism and national identity in Japan and Korea. And more recently, Professor Lee's interests have turned towards environmentalism and sustainability. So his most recent book is called Japan, the Sustainable Society, and it was published by the University of California Press in 2021. And it was awarded the Best Book Prize in the Social Sciences category by the International Association of Asia Scholars in 2023. He also has another book out with Routledge entitled The Global Environmental Crisis, and another monograph forthcoming entitled The Consolation of Social Theory. And today, Professor Lee will be giving a lecture entitled Individualism in Japanese Life. Professor Lee, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna, for your kind introduction. What I'd like to talk about today is what I think is still a raging stereotype about Japanese people and society, which is that Japan remains something of a collectivist society, one that valorizes, if you will, harmony, is quite hierarchical, homogeneous, group-oriented, and conformist. And this is, of course, a vision made vis-a-vis the West, in particular the United States. I actually think this is completely wrong, and I have been saying this for about 40 years, so I think maybe this is one of the last times I'll say it. But I think it's something of a shibboleth. Shibboleth has a particular meaning, which is a linguistic term that separates insider from outsider. I mean, meaning it's something that you either believe as an insider, and if you're an outsider, you just don't get it. An example of this is, of course, Lollapalooza, which means, of course, great show or entertainment, but in fact was used by US soldiers during the latter stage of World War II in the passive stage. It was used to distinguish Japanese people from non-Japanese, Filipinos, Chinese, even Japanese Americans. I mean, the point, of course, is that back then, very few Japanese could distinguish between L and R sound, and would hence pronounce Lollapalooza as Lollapalooza, and immediately would be shot by US GIs. That's one reason, I think, to learn English, I suppose. The abstract, or what I will do for the rest of this lecture, is very simple. I will say again that this is wrong, and then I'll try to account for, in some way, why the stereotype persists. And finally, I will try to transcend or supersede the strange individualism, collectivism dialectic, and suggest actually this is a wrong way to frame the question in any case. So first, some of the empirical materials that social scientists have diligently collected or produced. If you look at social surveys done by Japanese and non-Japanese social scientists over the last 40 years or so, one striking fact emerges, which is that Japanese don't do very well on the collectivist value scale. So I'll give you several examples. One is in the realm of personal responsibility. So if you ask people around the world, in this case, 35 OECD countries, there are 39 now, but there were only 35 when the survey was done, on the people's support for government assistance to, say, the poor for medical assistance, support for the elderly, financial and otherwise, or support for college tuitions for those in need, Japanese ranked the last 35 out of 35 countries. Meaning at least that Japanese valorize personal responsibility, sense of self-reliance, that is the hallmark of individualism. And if you ask, this is from the Gallup Foundation, a survey of 125 countries on the willingness to help strangers, people you don't know, Japanese again ranked the last 125 out of 125 on the simple question, are you going to help a stranger in need? Second set of examples. So how do the Japanese claim they relate to the world, at least societally? In a survey of 20 different countries, actually done by Monkasho, Ministry of Education, among others, Japanese said that they had no relations outside family members. That is to say, the proportion of people who said they have no relations outside their family were the lowest, 20 out of 20. And if you look at one question, for example, I think will give you a sense of what that's about. The question is, have you helped a stranger in the recent past? Americans said, 39% of Americans said yes. Only 5% of Japanese said yes. I mean, the point being that if you extrapolate from this question, Japanese tend to stay within the shell. Maybe not be a hallmark of individualism, but they're individualistic in their way of life. The final question is, well, how about within the family? You know, are they warm and cuddly, conversing into the night about this, that, and other? Well, answer is no. I mean, this is not a particularly scientific survey, but when you ask Japanese couples, how much time do you spend talking to each other? 56%, over half, said less than 30 minutes. Not very much. And if you ask them furthermore, do you wish that you had more time to talk to your spouse? 56% said no. So what does this mean? Well, meta-analysis has a particular meaning in social sciences. It's usually statistical in nature, but it's a way to gather different studies and come up with something of a synthesis. And the plain fact is, wherever you look, it's basically almost impossible to find surveys in which Japanese are found to be more collectivist than Americans. About the only exception I can think of is Hofstede's cultural values survey, which I think is quite problematic. There's a book by a Japanese social psychologist which summarized the survey data until 2008. And if you can read Japanese, I would recommend that book. But if you are still skeptical that somehow Japanese must be collectivist or group-oriented, I think perhaps the most telling finding I have found so far is a study, kind of a temporal survey by Imamura Yoko. And what she does is she studies the way of commensality, meaning eating together. And essentially, Japanese people tend not to eat together. One of the great findings she has is that in many households, they don't even have dining room tables. And when they have dining room tables, many of them even don't have enough chairs for all the family members living in the household. And what's interesting about this to me, the phenomena is called koshoku, or lonely eating, or individual eating in Japan. It's very common. It's that if you look at a book, say Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, which was supposed to talk about the collapse of community in American life and the rise of lonely Americans, he actually never mentions this phenomena of lonely eating in this 700-page book. And when other social scientists have done cross-cultural surveys, it never actually occurs to them that eating alone is actually an option. Okay, so now that I've dispatched the empirical part to my satisfaction, I'm not sure if it's to your satisfaction, I will then try to ask and answer, why is it that this idea has persisted? My answer is very simple. It's just a stereotype. It is true that in the pre-World War II period, Japanese people were collectivist, group-oriented, and featured many of the attributes that I mentioned at the outset. Because in agrarian or traditional communities, they are perforce collectivist, group-oriented. A good example or an insight or a vision or snapshot of this is, say, reading Oe Kenzaburo's novel. In one of his first novels, he talks really about essentially his experience growing up in Kagawa-ken in Shikoku. And you see the main character, loosely based on Oe himself, being scolded by village elders. And there's a lot of collective discipline. However, by 1970s, just by the title, Kojinteiki na Taiken, personal matter in English, I think, it's quite clear that individual is at the forefront. There's in fact a novel published in 1984 called Quiet Life or Shizuka na Seikatsu, which takes place in Berkeley because Oe comes as a visiting professor. What's interesting about this novel is he's alone in Berkeley. And the only contact he has with Japan is occasional phone calls and letters. So you see in a snapshot this amazing transformation from an agrarian, traditional, collectivist society into urban, individualistic society that Japan has become. And if you wonder if there's collectivism left, well, sure. There are 3% of Japanese employed population who still engage in agriculture, but over 70%, that is 3% of the total population, are over the age of 70. I mean, meaning that what may have been true 50, 60 years ago is no longer so. And I think there's also a bit of historical amnesia, or forgetting. I mean, that is to say, if you look at older books written by Japanese people about Japanese culture, they don't actually think that Japan is particularly collectivist. I mean, they don't particularly think Japanese are individualistic either. But if you read, say, Uchimura Kanzo's Representative Japanese, Daikyo-teki na Nihonjin from 1894, which he wrote in English, you see that every representative Japanese is hyper-individualistic. Everyone from Shinran and Nichiren, they work, they say and act in highly individualistic way, non-conformist way. But the reason I think the stereotype sticks in some way is the persistence of the comparison that Japanese people still make. I mean, that is to say, when Japan compares itself to the outside world, the singular comparison is often with the United States, the victor in the last war. And indeed, to Japanese eyes, I suppose, Americans may look more heterogeneous, more conflict-oriented, more individualistic and less group-oriented, and less conformist. The origin of this view, I think, is the single best read book in English on Japan, Ruth Benedict's Chrysanthemum and the Sword, published in 1946. I mean, she doesn't actually talk about how Japanese are individualistic. She does talk about in this rather long book, in about 10, 15 pages or so, how Japan can be described as a culture of, if you will, shame. From a collectivist, you care about what others are thinking, as opposed to the West, Christian, the West, in which people tend to have conscience and a sense of guilt. So they are a culture of guilt and more individualistic. The book is, I think, something of a disaster as a work of social science in some ways. I mean, because, if you're a social anthropologist, you're supposed to do field work. Talk to people who live in situ in Japan. She couldn't do that, of course. She didn't even know Japanese. So what she did was collect a bunch of films, writings in English, and through translators, interviewed Japanese Americans. Not really sure how that works because, as Professor Nagayoshi can tell you, immigrants tend to assimilate over time, but also Japanese POWs, prisoners of war. And she is one of the reasons we still have the emperor in Japan, because she claimed that all Japanese are fanatically loyal to the emperor. In any case, let's forget about that. She couldn't go, there are other qualified Japanologists, perhaps. There were no Annas around to do a great study, and so on. But the fundamental flaw, in my opinion, or in my view, is that she engages in something of cultural essentialism. She freezes Japan of 1930s and early 40s and decides that's what Japanese culture is about. But you have to remember that 1930s and early 40s were strange times. It was highly militarized, almost fascistic, certainly authoritarian in Japan, in which martial virtues, collectivism, hierarchy, and so on were valorized. Had she gone back, or had she done the study 100 years before, in mid-19th century, in the late Tokugawa Japan, she would have found something quite different. Had she spent time in Edo, hanging out with townspeople, chonin, or going to the village, she would have found much less hierarchy and much more egalitarian, if you will, social relations. But she didn't do that. She just decided that 1930s and early 40s Japan represented all of Japanese culture, a pattern of culture in her arc of different cultures. But more devastatingly, in my opinion, what about the United States in late 40s and early 50s? Were they hyper-individualistic? Well, I think the answer is not really. If you look at the GIs, if you're Japanese, you found them very free-wheeling, very relaxed, giving up, Hershey's chocolate bars, hanging out with young women, blah, blah, blah. But what were they like back in the barracks? I will bet last penny of the last yen I have is that they belong to an extremely collectivist, hierarchical, conformist, and group-oriented environment. Yes, sir, is the norm in the military, even today. I mean, that is to say, in organization life, in military life, Americans are no more individualistic than Japanese soldiers in the military. That's what the military is. More seriously, social psychology had its golden age in late 40s and 50s with a bunch of very interesting social experiments. Solomon Asch's conformity experiment being one of them. Essentially what he did, it's on the YouTube, so you can look for replication of that study, was videotaped. If you have two sticks, one quite long and one very short, you ask people which one is longer. And basically everyone who is cited can see that the longer one is longer. But if you have a plant, sakura in Japanese, who says the short one is longer, in Asch's experiment at least, something like 35 to 40% says short one is shorter against obvious visual evidence. I mean, that is to say, Americans can be extremely conformist. And what's interesting about this is when Japanese social psychologists have tried to replicate Asch's experiment, they actually found that the rate of conformity among Japanese are actually lower. But more devastatingly, perhaps, the image that US social scientists and cultural critics delineated about American society is actually not one of hyper-individualism and self-reliance. Rather, the most famous one was written by one of my teachers, David Reisman, called The Lonely Crowd, in which, of course, he made the distinction, somewhat akin to Benedict's distinction, between outer-directed people, people who care about what others think, and inner-directed people who care what one thinks, self-reliant, and claimed that most Americans are outer-directed. It's a manifestation of mass society in which, yes, they're individuals, but they're quite conformist, and they don't actually march to their own drum. A footnote here is that Professor Reisman goes to Japan in late 60s, or actually 65, 6, for 4 months, and writes a very long book, much longer than The Lonely Crowd, called Conversations in Japan, Nihon Nikki in Japanese. Japanese are very good at translating American books. Not mine, but mine are no good, I suppose. In any case, I mean, what's kind of interesting about Reisman is he's a very honest chap. So he says, you know, somewhere around page 100, that, gee, I've been here for 4 weeks now, and finally, I am beginning to tell Japanese people apart. I mean, it's hard to blame him. Maybe he wasn't used to seeing Japanese people, but I wouldn't write a book on Japanese culture and society a few months later, not knowing Japanese, not being able to tell Japanese people apart. But that's one of the problems, that it's a stereotype, meaning that Japanese people to American social scientists and American visitors basically looked alike. And so the truth that Japanese are collectivists, herd-like, were aired, written down, and dutifully reproduced in Japanese life. The Victor Americans said, we are collectivists, we must be collectivists. I'm using a rather simplistic view, perhaps, but I think it's not that far from truth. Again, another footnote to a footnote. In primatology, there's something called the Japanese method. Primatologists who study gorillas, chimps, and whatnot. And what's interesting about the so-called Japanese method, pioneered by Japanese primatologists in the 1950s, was the idea to tell chimpanzees or gorillas apart as individuals. We study them as individuals and look for individual differences. Americans and Western primatologists until then simply saw them as a herd, as a homogeneous, interchangeable organism. Okay, now I will move to the last part. Why is it that we like to say some societies are individualistic, others are collectivistic? I think has a lot to do with a particular social evolutionary way of looking at the world in which people believe that traditional people are collectivists, modern people are more individualistic. But I think this is actually quite misleading. And I think we can get a hint from Constant's essay comparing traditional ancient liberties. I won't explain it in the interest of time, but what he's saying essentially is something along this line. There was always individualism in traditional societies. It's just that it was restricted to the elite, the nobility. They could do whatever they wanted. They could say whatever they wanted, right? But the idea of modern individualism, like modern liberty, is that idea spreads, if you will, to the public, to everyone, but it's vitiated or attenuated over time. In modern society, even though we are individualistic in some way, we cannot do what we want. We cannot act like the landlord of the nobility in medieval Europe or medieval Japan. So you say, what is this idea of a modern self? The classic definition of enlightenment was offered by Immanuel Kant in his essay, Answer to the Question, What is Enlightenment? And he says essentially that people, individuals, begin to think for themselves. You become self-reliant. You don't follow the masses. And certainly, if I use a term that Japanese used to use very often, it is certainly the tatemae. Kind of, it's what we like to think about ourselves, and not honne, which is what we really are, or what we really do. We like to believe that we're rugged individualists, but we actually don't act like that, right? And why is that? I will get that in a moment. But Japanese believe in this Western ideal, Western tatemae, and try to become more Western and escape the feudal, backward Japanese past. That's what I knew is the term. Stop being Asian and become more like European. But what they miss, I think, is the reality that even in the West, though there are these ideals, people don't actually act like that. And the reason is we live in, simply put, organizational society or organized society. It's not just the military I mentioned. It's not just the US soldiers, but we are all, to some extent, within organizations, somewhat homogeneous, quite conflict averse, used to the hierarchy, are group oriented, and conformist. I am no exception. I like to think that I'm a rugged individualist, throwing out strange, new, exciting ideas, but we are all deeply conformist. We care what others think, fellow scholars, but also colleagues. We don't act out like individuals. After all, we have been socialized, many years of schooling. We are invaded by the deep state, as it were. They do tell us what to do, right? At University of Tokyo, you have to take these training modules. I should not engage in sexual harassment. I should not engage in power harassment. I should not be a fool and be a victim of the cyber crime, blah, blah, blah. So this happens precisely when the idea of individualism has spread. We all think we're individuals, but for much of our waking life, we live in this new collectivist state in organization, in organized society. And this happens precisely when tradition has corroded or collapsed. We live in urban societies. Certainly many Japanese live in big cities who are in turn under-socialized. And indeed, if you look at the actual practice of civic participation, time spent on the smartphone, and others, you'll see that Japanese are in fact more hyper-individualized than Americans. So let me turn to the conclusion then. So what I try to do is to say very simply, Japanese are not individualistic, whatever measure you may find. However, it's believed in part because it's a stereotype, and also because the day-to-day life, everyday life of Japanese is dominated by organizations and other organizations telling people what to do. And it's precisely this contradiction that gives power or resonance to the idea that Japanese remain a collectivist, conformist society. If you talk to young people in Japan, they say, I hate conformity pressure, peer pressure. But what society is without conformity pressure, especially in organizations? So what's the point of all this? Well, as I tried to say, it's something that's bugged me for 40 years. So I need to say it one more time. Japanese are not particularly collectivist. But it's also, I think, an instance at once of Orientalism and auto-Orientalism. Orientalism in the sense that Western social scientists who don't know much about Japan, don't know Japanese language, haven't spent much time in Japanese society, make up these rather strange tales about the Japanese. But the weirder thing, perhaps, is that Japanese then translate these ideas and believe them. Oh, a famous Harvard sociologist said this. It must be true. Well, it's not. He didn't know anything about Japan. More seriously, I think the idea of collectivism and Japan as non-individualistic actually has a lot of harm. And it shows up in a range of social policies and values in Japanese societies. I mean, personally, I find it problematic that Japanese are so against, if you will, providing social support, social help for the needy. Talented, but, financially strapped young people who want to go to universities. Why is that? Well, one reason I will suggest is the power of individualism. That's what Japanese are taught. We should be individualist. And I think this is deeply problematic in our society, even Japanese society. And I think also explains in part the power of populism in Japanese society, especially if you read the internet. Why are they going on and on about the deep state, about the favors done to ethnic Koreans or ethnic Chinese or immigrants or women, blah, blah, blah. These young people are angry because they believe in the value of rugged individualism. And within, again, highly organized and organizational society in which they feel that it is wrong, that I cannot act out to do whatever the F I want to do. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Lee, for this lecture.